Hello everyone. In the next following slides, I would like to share with you the results of a series of experiments that we did using synthetic data and a real data case, where we tried to perform phase classification and surface interpretations using a direct probabilistic inversion of ABO data. So let's start by looking at this illustration of how a typical phase classification workflow looks like. So we would start with some seismic data, in this case AVO seismic data, and we will perform an AVO inversion to basically estimate the elastic properties that can model or that can explain the input seismic data. So in this case, we chose to describe our data in terms of acoustic impedance, BPBS, and density values. And at this point, we're going to start facing one of the most challenging problems with pretty much any inversion problem, which is a non-uniqueness of the solution, meaning that there could actually exist many different AI, BPBS, and density models that would model the same AVO response. So in a deterministic inversion, we would typically choose an optimal solution and we'd move on with that solution into the workflow. So the second step in the phase classification workflow would be performing a rock physics inversion to basically convert all those elastic properties that we just obtained in our AVO inversion into reservoir properties. So in this case, we have chosen V-clay, porosity, and water saturation. And we're going to face one more time here the non-uniqueness, the problem of non-uniqueness of our solution. So we would actually introduce a higher level of non-uniqueness into the whole process. But again, an optimal solution would be chosen and or would be obtained, and the lithology classification would be performed based on that result. Now, the problem with this workflow is that at the end there could actually exist many different lithophases models that would actually explain the whole data that was involved in this process. But again, in a deterministic approach, we would only get one model out of all the possible solutions that might exist. Now, what we try to do on a direct probabilistic inversion is actually bypass those two inversion steps and go directly from the AVO data to the lithophases models. And more importantly, because of the probabilistic nature of this approach, we not only get all the possible solutions to this problem, but we will also get the probabilities related to each one of those models. That will allow us to basically make more informed decisions or choices in our interpretation. So the basis of all this approach is the prior probabilities that we set up in our inversion. Now that prior framework usually starts with a list of the phases expected to be present, and a very important ingredient that will allow us to narrow down the solution space is actually the existence of any ordering relationships. So for example, questions like, is fluid gravitational ordering safe to assume? Or are younger rocks always on top of older rocks? Becomes very relevant because this kind of information can be basically encoded in terms of probabilities in the prior framework. So that way, the solution space will be reduced to only to the solutions that basically comply with this with these assumptions. Now, something important is that we need to ensure that the facies constellation that we are setting up in our prior framework is broad enough so that it includes not only facies that have been sampled by the wells in the area, but that it might also include facies that might exist but have not been sampled yet in the area. Now that information will be combined with basically an information that describes the probability distribution of the facies thicknesses, and that what we'll basically do is that will allow us to model the Earth in terms of a set of transition probabilities, which represent a Markov model of how the subsurface looks like. Now here is an example of one of those transition probability matrices, and here you can see what I think is a very neat mathematical representation of the stratigraphy that is present in a given area. So for example, we can see here that the probability of transitioning from a Dolo siltstone into Dolo sandstone is of around 0.2. More importantly, on this matrix, we can see that there are some transitions that are very rare or very unlikely to exist, like for example, transitioning from a hydrocarbon Dolo siltstone into a Dolo sandstone. In this example, is a very rare event. So this kind of transition would be basically unlikely to exist in our final solution. Now, another important piece of information in this matrix is the information that is contained in the diagonal, because basically what we have here is the probability of one facies transitioning into a sample of the same facies. So these probabilities on the diagonal are actually related with the thickness, with the mean thickness of that given facies into our model. So that's a kind of information that, for example, is very hard to integrate into a deterministic inversion. But here on a probabilistic inversion is very straightforward to include, and is also very important to basically constrain the solution space of our inversion problem. Now that a second ingredient, very important ingredient into the prior framework is the statistical rock physics model, where we will basically try to capture the observed distribution of elastic properties in each facies. And we include information like correlation lengths or property cross correlations. And again, we need to make sure to extend these distributions to ensure that they are broad and yet plausible. Now, here's just a flow chart illustrating how all this information is integrated. So here we have our prior framework. So we're going to sample this prior framework very heavily so that we will get a very large number of possible facies configurations. And here at the bottom, we have our input seismic data. So we are going to extract wavelets out of this seismic data, and we're going to use those wavelets to basically localize our problem. So instead of trying to come up with a full sequence of the facies configurations that gave rise to the whole trace, we are going to actually to break down the problem into finding what is the most likely facies configuration that would explain the data within one or two wavelets length. So that's what is represented here. That's a neighborhood posterior of that a given facies configuration existing given a set of seismic traces. And that's going to be proportional to the probability of this set of seismic traces existing given this facies configuration times the probability of that facies configuration existing. And that's going to be integrated to come up with our marginal posteriors that basically contains the probability of each facies happening at each depth sample or time sample. So here is the first of those synthetic experiments. Here, this experiment is dealing with elastic ambiguity. And all we have done here is we created this model with two facies, a dark facies and a light facies. And you can see here on these cross plots that those two facies, they totally overlap on the elastic domain. Basically, they have the same BPBS, AI, and density values. The only difference between these two facies is that one varies faster than the other. So that basically means that they have different correlation lengths. Now, we put that data through our inversion. We assume a prior model where we have just a 50% chance of one facies or the other existing in our model. These are the posteriors we got, and this is the most probable facies that we can get based on these posteriors. And here is the true facies, basically showing how the most probable facies extracted from our posteriors matches exactly the true facies that we used to create the data. Now, in this, here is the second synthetic experiment, this case dealing with thin beds and the effect of increasing noise levels. So for this experiment, we now are dealing with 5 different facies. We have here a gas sand, an oil sand in red, a brine sand in yellow, and here in green we have a shale facies, and in olive we have a silt facies. And you can see that those last two facies, they overlap. So they are also ambiguous, like in the previous example. And here we have the facies sequence that we use to create the synthetic data. And you can see that many of the layers that we use in this synthetic are way below seismic resolution. So here is the results of the noise-free case. So basically, this was the input data. These are the posterior probabilities. This is the most likely facies, and here is the ground truth. And you can see how the inversion, in this case, was able to resolve all the thin layers that were present in the model, and was also able to discriminate perfectly between the shell and the silt facies. Now, if we add some noise, things starts to change. Like, for example, you can see that now we didn't get all those, many of those layers, or very thin layers, with the silt facies. Basically, what seems to have happened is that the introduction of noise into our problem basically harmed our ability to solve that ambiguity between the shell and the silt facies. However, we can still see some of those silt probabilities on the posterior, but because we chose the most likely facies to represent our final result, we are not seeing many of those silt facies in our solution. But maybe choosing a different metric, we still might be able to get some of those silts back into the solution. Now here is a very noisy case where we now added more noise, and what you can see is that now we are starting to fail the prediction of some of those sand phases. But something interesting is that these very thin oil sands were still recovered in our solution. Now here is the real data case. Now we're going to be dealing with actual seismic data recorded at the Cooper Basin in Australia. The data in this area is known to be very challenging, basically because varying amounts of calcite distorts the seismic signal, and the thicknesses of the reservoirs are at or below the seismic resolution. The data we use for this experiment consisted of 8 angle stacks between 5 to 40 degrees, and we use P-wave, shear wave, sonic logs, density, clay volume, porosity, and saturation logs from 8 representative wells, and 4 regional interpreted horizons. So here is just a look at how the seismic data looks like. So you can see here within this window how it is really challenging to basically track or interpret any horizons. And this window happens to be the time window where the reservoirs will be sitting at. So again, here just a series of cross plot illustrating the distribution of the phases we define for this problem. And here on the right is just a thickness analysis of each one of those phases. So basically, this information is what we use to build or to compute that transition matrix that will constrain our solution space. Now, here is the data of one of the wells. Here we have the petrophysics, the interpreted phases, and here are the priors, the prior probabilities for each one of those phases at each time sample. And on the right is just the seismic data. And now we have overlaid on this seismic section the probability of finding, or the prior probability of finding the blue phases, which was the target in this study. Now here is the prior, or sorry, the posterior, basically our inversion result at this well, and you can see all the details, the level of detail that was introduced by the probabilistic inversion. And here on the section, we have now overlaid the probability of finding that blue phases within that window. And you can see that in spite of the lack of coherency and continuity on the seismic events, we got a body that shows a very nice lateral continuity, as the interpreters were expecting to see on this area. Now, we can tweak this problem, and instead of asking the inversion for the probabilities for each one of the phases in our model, we can actually interrogate the inversion to provide what is the probability of transitioning into a specific phases. So in this case, what we have are the probabilities of transitioning into a sand phases. So these basically represent, or can be interpreted as the tops of those phases. And basically, by performing this inversion on many or over the whole volume, we can get horizons that would represent the surfaces at which the top of that phases might be found. Here is just assumed a view of those results. Here is the seismic section, and here are the surfaces represented by those probabilities of finding the top of ascent. So finally, to conclude, as I show you, the seismic IBO inverse problem can be solved as a Bayesian inference problem. And what is very important about this approach is that information from multiple sources can be integrated, and thicknesses below seismic resolution can be resolved. And our synthetics basically demonstrated how elastic ambiguity can be handled by integrating additional geological or stratigraphical information. And more importantly, surfaces and their corresponding uncertainties can also be estimated. So with that, I would like to conclude. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions. And thanks for listening.